The wail tore through the cabin like a siren. It wasn't the soft cry of a fussy infant, it was sharp, relentless, and desperate. Every passenger in first class on Flight 782 felt it vibrate through their bones, a sound that clawed at patience and stripped nerves raw. For the last 3 hours, the screaming had been constant. No pauses. No mercy. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, billionaire investor, philanthropist, and man who prided himself on being in control of every detail of his empire. But tonight, 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the mask was gone. His Italian silk shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat. His jaw was tight, his eyes bloodshot, and in his trembling arms was his 6-month-old daughter, Isabella, face crimson, tiny fists thrashing, lungs seemingly made of steel. Ethan had faced hostile boardrooms, courtroom battles, and billion-dollar negotiations that turned on a single word. None of it compared to this. He bounced her. Nothing. He offered a bottle. She spat it out. He whispered soothing nonsense. She screamed louder. The wealthy titan of industry looked like a man defeated. Around him, the tension boiled over. A silver-haired woman in pearls muttered under her breath, "Some people shouldn't be allowed to travel with babies." A businessman across the aisle shoved his laptop into his bag and jammed noise-canceling headphones over his ears, glaring at Ethan as though he had committed a crime. 2 college students whispered furiously, shooting daggers at the billionaire. "I can't believe we paid for first class just for this," one hissed. Even the flight attendants, trained to smile through chaos, were cracking. One, her bun unraveling, knelt beside Ethan. Her voice was tight, forced calm stretched to breaking. "Sir, we've had multiple complaints. Is there anything else we might try? Anything at all?" Ethan pressed a monogrammed handkerchief to his forehead, his voice hoarse. "I've tried everything. Everything." His words trembled. "Pacifier, bottle, rocking, nothing works. Please give me a minute." The attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking to the rows of furious passengers. She straightened, smoothing her uniform, but her plastered smile no longer masked the irritation underneath. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Words like "unfit father" and "emergency landing" darted like knives through the pressurized air. The captain himself had sent a message forward: if the disturbance couldn't be resolved soon, more drastic action might be considered. Ethan felt the weight of 100 eyes boring into him, each one a judgment, a condemnation. He, the man who owned penthouses, yachts, and entire companies, sat helpless in a wide leather seat, undone by a baby no bigger than a loaf of bread. Humiliation twisted in his chest. He wasn't just failing as a father. He was failing publicly. Isabella screamed harder, as if sensing his despair. In the cramped economy cabin beyond the heavy curtain, the sound was impossible to ignore. Every cry cut through the recycled air, reaching the ears of a small figure curled in seat 42B. She was no more than 10 years old. Skin deep brown, hair braided neatly by careful hands, dressed in faded jeans and a hoodie 2 sizes too big. She pressed her forehead to the window, trying to drown out the chaos with thoughts of home, of her mother's gentle voice, of her younger cousins she often soothed when their mothers worked long shifts. But the crying pulled at her. She had heard this sound before, the sharp, gasping cries of a baby not just upset, but in real distress. She remembered rocking her baby cousin for hours, humming the old lullabies her grandmother taught her. She remembered how the rhythm of her touch could bring peace when nothing else could. Her small hands gripped the armrest. Her chest rose and fell with a decision that made her heart pound. Back in first class, Ethan buried his face in his hands for a moment. He had imagined this flight would be an inconvenience, yes, but manageable. His wife had insisted she'd meet them in Paris. He believed he could handle one simple journey alone. Now, under the glares of millionaires and magnates, he realized he was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. "Sir." Another flight attendant crouched down, her tone firmer this time. "We cannot continue like this. Do you want me to request medical personnel?" Sometimes, she hesitated, lowering her voice. Sometimes sedation is an option. Ethan's head snapped up. Sedation? She's a baby, not a wild animal. But the desperation in his voice betrayed him. The murmurs in the cabin swelled. "This is unbearable. They should turn the plane around. Money can't buy good parenting." Every word drove nails into Ethan's chest. His daughter's screams grew jagged, exhausting her tiny body, and he felt his own resolve splintering. Then, movement. The curtain at the edge of first class shifted. A flight attendant blocked the aisle immediately, sharp voice cutting through the cries. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." But it wasn't a ma'am. It was a child. The little black girl from economy stepped forward, head bowed slightly, hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes were wide but steady, her voice soft but carrying in the tense silence. "Excuse me," she said. I think I can help." The words dropped like a stone in water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Dozens of skeptical eyes fixed on the child standing in the aisle. The businessman snorted. "What's she gonna do? She's a kid." The silver-haired woman scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Even the flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Sweetheart, please sit down. This isn't." But Ethan, holding his red-faced daughter who had screamed herself nearly breathless, lifted his head. His eyes, bloodshot, desperate, searching, locked onto the girls. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the three of them. The billionaire, the inconsolable baby, and the child who had dared to step forward. The girl took one cautious step closer, voice trembling but firm. "Please, let me try." The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with disbelief and uneasy anticipation. Passengers leaned forward. Flight attendants froze. Even Isabella's cries seemed to falter, as if the baby herself sensed a shift. Ethan's lips parted, his breath caught between pride, suspicion, and a father's raw desperation. Would he risk it? Would he hand his precious daughter, his only child, to a stranger, to a child herself? The moment stretched like taffy, unbearable in its tension. And just as Ethan began to lower his arms, the narrator's voice cut in. Her name was Naomi Brooks. 10 years old, though people often said her eyes made her look older, eyes that carried the weight of responsibility far beyond her years. She lived with her mother in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. The hallway always smelled faintly of fried onions and old carpet, and the paint peeled from the walls like flakes of tired skin. But for Naomi, it was home. Her world was small but full of love. Her mother, Danielle, worked long shifts as a nurse's aide, sometimes overnight, sometimes double shifts that stretched until dawn. Naomi understood more than most children did about sacrifice. She never complained when her mom came home exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, her eyes bloodshot. Instead, Naomi picked up the slack, watching her younger cousins when her aunt had to work late, helping neighbors carry groceries, even rocking babies to sleep when cries echoed through their building's thin walls. Everyone in the building knew Naomi had the touch. It started when she was just 7. Her aunt's newborn son, Darius, had colic, crying for hours, impossible to soothe. Doctors prescribed drops, her aunt tried every trick she read online, but nothing worked. Naomi, small and determined, had climbed onto the couch, taken the baby in her arms, and began humming a lullaby her grandmother used to sing. Slowly, miraculously, the crying eased. Within minutes, Darius was asleep. Her aunt had stared in disbelief. "You're magic, girl." From then on, Naomi became the unofficial babysitter of the block. Mothers trusted her. Babies melted in her arms. It wasn't just the lullabies or the rocking motion, it was the way Naomi listened, the way she attuned herself to a child's needs with patience most adults lacked. Her mother sometimes shook her head in wonder. "It's like God put a gift in your hands, baby. A gift money can't buy." Naomi would smile shyly but never say much. To her, it wasn't magic. It was simply love, given freely, the way her mom had taught her. But Naomi's life wasn't easy. Her school was overcrowded, her teachers overworked. She often sat at the back of the class, quiet, overlooked. When she raised her hand, she was sometimes ignored. When she turned in her assignments, they were marked with little comment, as if her efforts barely mattered. Kids teased her for her hand-me-down clothes, for the way her mother braided her hair instead of paying for fancy salon styles. Some days she pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the notebook where she scribbled stories and drew patterns that made sense only to her. Yet beneath her shy exterior, Naomi carried dreams bigger than anyone around her realized. She wanted to travel the world, to see places she had only read about in library books: Paris, Tokyo, Cape Town. She wanted to learn languages, meet people, and prove that even a girl from a forgotten corner of the city could shine. The ticket to that possibility had come in the form of a miracle, a free seat on an international flight. A local community program, funded by donations, had selected Naomi and a handful of other kids for an educational exchange trip. For the first time in her life, Naomi would leave the country, flying across the ocean to spend 2 weeks in a cultural program in Europe. Her mother had cried when the acceptance letter arrived. "Baby, this is the chance I always prayed for you. You go out there and show them who you are." The days leading up to the trip were filled with nervous excitement. Naomi packed and repacked her small suitcase, folding and refolding the same 3 outfits, slipping in her notebook and the small stuffed bear her grandmother had given her before she passed. The night before departure, her mother knelt by her bed. "You're going to do amazing things, Naomi. Just remember, you belong wherever your feet land. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Naomi had hugged her mother tight, memorizing the smell of lavender lotion and the steady heartbeat beneath her chest. On the morning of the flight, Naomi dressed in her favorite hoodie, the one with fraying sleeves but soft from years of wear. At the airport, she marveled at the glass ceilings, the flashing boards with city names she couldn't pronounce. She clutched her boarding pass like it was made of gold. Her group leader guided her onto the plane, directing her to a cramped seat in economy. Naomi didn't care. To her, it felt like the start of a story she'd only ever dared to imagine. But as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off, she heard it, the sharp cry from the front of the cabin. At first, she thought it was just a fussy baby. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the cries became unbearable, a constant wail that filled every corner of the aircraft. Other passengers groaned, rolled their eyes, complained loudly. Naomi, instead, listened. Really listened. And she recognized the sound. It was the same desperate cry her cousin had once made, the same cry she had soothed 100 times before. Her fingers tapped nervously on the armrest. Her chest tightened. She knew she could help. But who would believe her? She was just a little girl from the back of the plane. Still, something inside her refused to stay silent. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt, heart pounding. And as she stood, taking her first step toward first class, passengers turned, eyebrows raised, whispers following her. Her small figure emerged from the curtain, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me. I think I can help." His name was Ethan Caldwell. To the outside world, that name meant power. It meant skyscrapers in his portfolio, headlines on the business networks, and a personal net worth so staggering that people whispered about it at charity galas. At 46 years old, Ethan was a self-made billionaire, or at least, that was the story he preferred people to tell. Raised in modest circumstances, he had clawed his way up with ruthless determination, building Caldwell Global from a startup in his garage to a multinational empire spanning technology, energy, and finance. He was the man who never lost. The man who always had a plan. The man who controlled everything around him. Or so people thought. The truth was more complicated. Behind the expensive suits and carefully managed press appearances was a man who rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. A man who kept spreadsheets of his own schedule down to the minute, terrified of wasting time. A man who, despite his wealth, often felt isolated, surrounded by assistants, consultants, and executives, but rarely by people who truly knew him. And perhaps the deepest irony of all, the one area of his life where money and strategy seemed to mean nothing was fatherhood. His daughter, Isabella, had been born late in his life, the unexpected product of a marriage already strained by distance. His wife, Serena, was brilliant and ambitious, with a career in international diplomacy that often kept her abroad. She had wanted a child. Ethan, though unsure, had agreed, believing he could simply add father to his list of roles, like another business venture to manage. But babies, he discovered, did not follow spreadsheets. They did not respond to carefully planned strategies. And no amount of money could buy the one thing Isabella needed most, his patience. In his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, Ethan often stood at the glass windows in the dead of night, Isabella crying in his arms, wondering how he, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals, could not negotiate with a 6-month-old child. He had hired the best nannies, consulted pediatric experts, even installed a state-of-the-art nursery with technology designed to monitor every heartbeat and breath. Yet still, Isabella cried. Still, she fought his every attempt to soothe her. It made him feel powerless in a way he hated. And perhaps that was why he often avoided being alone with her. Business trips, late nights at the office, endless meetings, they were easier than facing the tiny human who seemed determined to expose his inadequacy. But life has a way of forcing collisions. The flight to Paris was supposed to be simple. Serena was already there for a summit. Ethan had decided, against his better judgment, that he could manage a single transatlantic flight alone with Isabella. His assistant had raised an eyebrow. "Sir, wouldn't it be easier to send a nanny?" But Ethan, prideful, had waved it off. "It's one flight. How hard can it be?" Now, as he sat in first class with his daughter screaming inconsolably in his arms, he realized the answer, harder than anything he had ever faced. The contrast between his life and the one he imagined for others was stark. For Ethan, flying usually meant private jets, champagne, and a crew that obeyed his every command. But Serena had insisted he take the commercial flight this time, to appear less ostentatious, she had argued. So here he was, trapped in a cabin with strangers who knew his name, knew his reputation, and watched him crumble in real time. It wasn't just the baby's screams that rattled him. It was the looks. The whispers. The barely concealed contempt. To them, he was still the billionaire, someone who should have had everything under control. And the fact that he didn't, made his failure even more glaring. Ethan's mind kept flashing back to the boardroom. In that world, he was untouchable. His voice commanded silence. His signature shifted markets. Competitors feared him, allies respected him, employees depended on him. But here, none of it mattered. Here, he was just a man holding a screaming child, helpless in front of an audience who had paid thousands for comfort, only to be given chaos. The humiliation gnawed at him. Sweat trickled down his temples. He tried rocking Isabella, whispering to her, bribing her with every toy stuffed into the designer diaper bag. Nothing worked. And the pressure kept mounting. "Sir," the flight attendant said again, crouching beside him. "If this continues, the captain may have to consider alternatives. We've had serious complaints." Ethan's stomach twisted. Alternatives? She gave a tight smile. An unscheduled landing. Medical intervention. "Sir, passengers are threatening to escalate this further." An unscheduled landing. The words hit him like a hammer. Dozens of angry passengers. News headlines. A scandal. A billionaire who couldn't manage his own baby. The very thought made his chest seize. He looked down at Isabella, her tiny face red with fury, and for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt something he had almost forgotten. Fear. It was in that fragile moment, his pride in ruins, his power meaningless, that he looked up and saw her. A small figure at the edge of the aisle. A child. Her hoodie was too big. Her sneakers scuffed. Her posture hesitant but steady. And her voice, soft yet firm, cut through the chaos. "Excuse me," she said. "I think I can help." Ethan blinked, certain he had misheard. A child? Offering to solve what he, one of the most powerful men in America, couldn't. The flight attendant bristled, ready to send the girl back to economy. Passengers muttered in disbelief. But Ethan's eyes, bloodshot, weary, desperate, remained locked on hers. For the first time in years, the man who always had a plan found himself without one. And something deep inside whispered, maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't going to come from power or wealth. Maybe it would come from the most unexpected place. The cabin was suffocating with noise. Isabella's shrill cries tore at every ear, a relentless soundtrack of misery. The flight attendant stood squarely in the aisle, arms crossed, blocking the child who had stepped forward. "Sweetheart," she said tightly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You really need to go back to your seat. This isn't the place for." But Naomi didn't move. Her small hands clutched the strap of her faded backpack, knuckles white. Her voice shook, but she spoke again, louder this time. "I can help." Her words seemed to hang in the air, impossible against the backdrop of the baby's wails and the murmurs of disbelief. Passengers shifted, craning for a better look. "A kid?" a man scoffed. "This is absurd," muttered the woman in pearls. "What's she gonna do, sing a nursery rhyme?" whispered one of the students in the back row of first class. Even Isabella's cries seemed to soften for half a beat, as if the baby herself were listening. Ethan's chest heaved. Sweat dampened his collar, his arms aching from cradling his daughter for hours. His mind screamed that this was ridiculous, entrusting his only child to a stranger, let alone a child herself. But the longer he stared at Naomi, the harder it became to dismiss her. There was something steady in her eyes. Something he hadn't seen in any of the attendants or even in himself, calm. The flight attendant tried again, firmer. "Sir, please, this isn't appropriate. We cannot allow." Ethan raised a hand, silencing her. His voice was rough, cracked. "Wait." The single word froze the cabin. Every head turned toward him, shocked. Was he really considering it? Naomi took a step closer. She lowered her voice, speaking only to him now. "Sometimes babies cry like that because they feel scared. Or they're too tired. I know what to do. Please. Let me try." Ethan's throat tightened. He searched her face, desperate to find a reason to say no. But all he saw was sincerity. Passengers exchanged looks. Some amused, some outraged. A businessman chuckled under his breath. The billionaires lost it. The woman in pearls whispered sharply, "You can't be serious. That's a child." But Ethan tuned them out. For the first time since the flight began, there was a flicker of hope in the storm. He glanced at Isabella. Her tiny body arched, her fists flailing, her face crimson. She looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. His options were running out. He swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "All right." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant's eyes widened. "Sir, are you sure?" I said all right. Ethan adjusted his grip and, with trembling hands, extended his daughter toward the little girl who had dared to step forward. The moment stretched unbearably. Naomi's small arms reached out, hesitant but steady. Gasps echoed as the billionaire placed his priceless treasure, his only child, into the care of someone society would dismiss as insignificant. Isabella squirmed, another cry ready to tear from her lungs. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Naomi cradled the baby against her chest, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear. Her hand moved in gentle, practiced circles against Isabella's back. She began to hum, a melody old and soothing, carried from her grandmother's voice to hers. Passengers leaned in. The murmurs stopped. The air itself seemed to pause. And then, the cries faltered. Isabella's tiny fists unclenched. Her breathing slowed. Within moments, the baby's shrieks melted into soft whimpers, and then silence. A stunned hush fell over the cabin. For the first time in hours, peace. Naomi rocked gently, still humming, her eyes lowered to the sleeping baby now nestled safely in her arms. The businessman pulled off his headphones, blinking in disbelief. The students exchanged open-mouthed stares. Even the woman in pearls clutched her chest. The flight attendants stood frozen, mouths parted, as though they had just witnessed the impossible. And Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire who had built empires, conquered markets, and faced down rivals without blinking, sat speechless, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. He had just been saved by a child. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. How did she do that? It's like magic. I've never seen anything like it. But Naomi wasn't listening. She was too focused on the tiny girl in her arms, patting gently, her humming steady. She knew this moment wasn't about her. It was about the baby who had finally found peace. Ethan leaned forward, his voice hoarse. What, how did you? Naomi looked up, her eyes calm but earnest. I just know what babies need sometimes. Simple. Humble. True. For a brief, surreal moment, the roles reversed. The billionaire, accustomed to commanding the world, sat in awe of a 10-year-old who had accomplished what all his money and resources could not. Passengers began to clap softly. The applause spread, row by row, until the cabin filled with the sound of relief and admiration. Naomi blushed, ducking her head, but held Isabella close, as though protecting her from the noise. Ethan watched, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years, gratitude. As the applause faded, the narrator's voice slipped in, low and steady. What you've just witnessed was extraordinary. But to understand how this little girl came to hold the power to change a billionaire's world, we need to look deeper. We need to go back to where her story truly began. The screen faded to black. The cabin had never felt so still. For hours, every inch of the plane had vibrated with Isabella's cries, but now the silence was almost shocking. Naomi sat carefully in the wide leather seat beside Ethan, the baby nestled against her chest. She continued humming, her small voice weaving through the hum of the engines. Isabella's tiny body softened completely, surrendering to sleep. Her cheeks, once flushed with strain, now relaxed into the innocence of dreams. Ethan couldn't stop staring. His hands, which had trembled moments ago, now hung useless at his sides. His eyes burned as he watched his daughter, who had screamed herself hoarse in his arms, rest peacefully in the embrace of a stranger. No. Not a stranger. A child. Whispers still floated through the cabin, disbelief sparking like electricity. I thought that baby would never stop. She's incredible. Did you see how fast she calmed her? One of the students leaned forward, eyes wide. It's like she's some kind of baby whisperer. The woman in pearls shook her head slowly, her earlier scorn melted into awe. I've raised 3 children, she murmured. And I've never seen anything like that. The applause had faded, but the atmosphere lingered, not irritation now, but reverence. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, choked with emotions he hadn't expected. Gratitude. Humility. And something sharper, shame. For the last 3 hours, he had been powerless, paralyzed by frustration and pride. He had hired experts, bought gadgets, read manuals. Yet none of it had mattered. This little girl, this ordinary passenger in a hoodie too big for her shoulders, had done what all his resources could not. He leaned closer, his voice low, almost trembling. How did you do that? Naomi looked up, her expression calm, though her cheeks flushed under his gaze. I know what babies need sometimes, she said softly. They cry when they're scared, or when they can't say what's wrong. You just have to listen, and show them you understand. Her words were simple, but they cut through Ethan like scripture. Listening. Understanding. Words he rarely practiced outside of boardrooms. The flight attendant who had tried to stop her now stood frozen nearby, her face a mixture of embarrassment and awe. She cleared her throat nervously. Sir, the baby seems fine now. Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. Fine. She's sleeping. His voice cracked on the word, as though he had forgotten what it sounded like. The attendant's gaze softened toward Naomi. You really do have a gift, don't you? Naomi shrugged slightly, adjusting Isabella's blanket. It's just something I've done since I was little. My cousins cry a lot. My grandma taught me some songs that always helped. Her humility only deepened the impact. She wasn't boasting, wasn't demanding credit. She simply was. Ethan leaned back in his seat, running a hand down his face. He could feel the judgment of the passengers shifting. Where once they had glared, now their gazes were tinged with something else, curiosity, respect, maybe even pity. But what struck him most wasn't their reaction. It was his own. He, Ethan Caldwell, billionaire, master strategist, had been brought to his knees by an infant. And rescued, not by another powerful figure, not by some specialist with a string of degrees, but by a child whose name he didn't even know. His pride stung, yes. But beneath it bloomed something unexpected. Gratitude. And an uncomfortable question, what else have I been too blind to see, simply because I thought I already knew everything? Naomi shifted slightly, careful not to wake Isabella. She glanced at Ethan, her voice gentle. You were doing your best, she said. Sometimes babies just need something different. It doesn't mean you're a bad dad. The words pierced deeper than she could have known. Ethan's chest tightened. Bad dad. It was a phrase he had feared, though no one dared say it to his face. Yet hearing it from her, without accusation, only reassurance, broke something loose inside him. He blinked quickly, fighting the sting in his eyes. He wasn't used to vulnerability, not in front of strangers. Around them, the cabin began to relax. Passengers settled into their seats, sighs of relief replacing groans of irritation. A businessman reopened his laptop. The students whispered excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. Even the woman in pearls offered Naomi a small nod of respect. Peace had returned, fragile but precious. And at the center of it sat Naomi, still humming, still holding the baby as though the entire plane had been depending on her all along. Minutes stretched into an hour. The plane hummed steadily through the night sky. Isabella remained asleep, her breath soft against Naomi's chest. Ethan watched, torn between relief and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Finally, he spoke again. What's your name? Naomi looked up, surprised. Naomi. He nodded slowly, tasting the name. Naomi, he repeated, as though committing it to memory. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, he said, "Thank you." 2 words he hadn't spoken sincerely in a long time. Naomi smiled faintly. "You're welcome." Simple. Direct. As though she hadn't just performed a miracle in front of 100 witnesses. Ethan studied her, this little girl with steady hands and ancient wisdom in her eyes. He couldn't quite understand it, but he knew, deep in his bones, that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And for the first time since the flight began, he allowed himself to lean back, close his eyes, and breathe. The billionaire had been saved, not by wealth, not by power, but by the quiet courage of a child. For a while, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of Naomi's lullaby tapering into silence. Isabella slept deeply, her tiny chest rising and falling, her hand curled loosely against Naomi's hoodie. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the scene. Every instinct told him to reclaim his daughter, to keep her close, to reassert control. Yet when he shifted forward, ready to reach out, he stopped. Something in Naomi's face, serene, focused, protective, made him hesitate. For the first time in months, his baby was at peace. And for the first time in his life, Ethan found peace in letting someone else take the lead. When the flight attendants brought dinner service, Ethan waved them off. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he turned slightly toward Naomi. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Naomi nodded, careful to keep her voice low. "My baby cousins cry a lot. I take care of them when my aunt works late." He raised an eyebrow. "How old are you?" 10. Ethan blinked. 10. Barely old enough to count allowances, yet here she was, accomplishing what he, a man with every advantage, couldn't. He cleared his throat. "You must be remarkable." Naomi shrugged, eyes on the baby. "I just help when people need me." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He thought of his world, contracts, acquisitions, negotiations. When had he last done something simply because someone needed him, without expecting a return? He leaned back, rubbing his temple. "You know," he said slowly, "in my world, people don't usually help. Not unless there's something in it for them." Naomi looked up at him, her gaze clear and unflinching. "That sounds lonely." The words, spoken so simply, left him stunned. Loneliness was something he never admitted, not even to himself. And yet, hearing it from her lips, it felt undeniable. For the first time that flight, Ethan found himself talking, not as a billionaire, not as a public figure, but as a man. He spoke about Isabella, about how terrified he was of failing as a father. About how he hadn't wanted to admit he was overwhelmed. About Serena, always gone, always focused on her career, leaving him to balance fatherhood with an empire. Naomi listened. Not politely, not with the distant nods he was used to from employees, but with genuine attention. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She simply listened. When he trailed off, embarrassed by his own vulnerability, Naomi offered the kind of wisdom that seemed impossibly old for her years. "You don't have to be perfect," she said softly. "Babies don't need perfect. They just need love. Even when you feel like you don't know what you're doing, if you hold them close, they'll know they're safe." Her words sank deep, breaking open the part of him that had been hardened by years of control and pride. Ethan studied her carefully. "Who taught you to think like that?" Naomi smiled faintly. "My mom. She works really hard, but she always tells me that being there for someone matters more than anything else." Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet admiration. Ethan wondered what kind of woman raised a daughter with such strength and kindness despite the weight of hardship. He found himself envying that mother, a woman with far fewer resources, yet who had succeeded in raising a child more grounded and capable than many adults he knew. As the hours of the flight stretched on, their conversation deepened. Naomi told him about her school, about the kids who teased her for hand-me-downs, about her love for drawing patterns and writing stories in her notebook. She admitted she sometimes felt invisible, overlooked. Ethan frowned at that. Invisible? "Naomi, you just did something no one else on this plane could do. You have a gift. You should never feel invisible." Naomi lowered her eyes, smiling shyly. "Most people don't see it that way." Then most people are fools, Ethan said firmly. His tone startled even him. But he meant it. He had sat in boardrooms with men who thought themselves titans, and not one of them had shown the quiet power this little girl carried in her hands. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the walls between them began to crumble. Ethan stopped seeing her as a child from economy class. He began to see her as Naomi. The girl with wisdom far beyond her years, who carried herself with a strength he couldn't explain. And Naomi, in turn, stopped seeing him as the cold, unreachable billionaire. She saw a tired man who was scared of failing his daughter, a man who had been taught that money could fix anything, until tonight, when he learned that it couldn't. Later, when Isabella stirred, Naomi handed her gently back to Ethan. His arms felt clumsy, uncertain, but Naomi guided him with quiet instructions. Hold her like this. Not too tight. Just enough so she feels your heartbeat. Ethan followed, awkward at first, but slowly, something shifted. Isabella nestled against him, calmer than she had been in his arms all night. Naomi smiled. See? She knows you love her. Ethan swallowed, emotion clogging his throat. For years, he had spoken in the language of markets and profits. But tonight, a 10-year-old had taught him the language his daughter needed most. By the time the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers drifted into uneasy sleep, Ethan and Naomi were still talking. About family. About dreams. About the things money couldn't buy. It was a strange picture, one of the richest men in the world and a little black girl from the back of the plane, leaning close in quiet conversation, as though they had known each other forever. And though neither of them realized it yet, this was only the beginning of a bond that would change both their lives. When the plane finally touched down in Paris, the story of Naomi calming the billionaire's baby had already begun to ripple among the passengers like folklore. But Naomi herself remained quiet, shrinking from the curious glances, clutching her backpack to her chest as she followed her group out into the bright, cavernous terminal. For Ethan, the memory of that night stayed lodged in his chest like a pebble he couldn't shake loose. For Naomi, though, it was only one chapter of a much larger story. Because long before the world called her extraordinary, she was just a girl from a neighborhood most people ignored. Back home, Naomi's days began before dawn. The alarm on her mother's old flip phone would buzz at 5 a.m., pulling her out of dreams. Naomi would slip quietly from bed, careful not to wake the cousins who sometimes slept on their couch, and begin her morning routine. She packed her mother's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, a thermos of coffee if they had any, and left it on the counter for when Danielle stumbled out in her scrubs. By the time her mother returned the weary smile Naomi knew so well, Naomi would already be braiding her own hair in the mirror, preparing for another day at school. School was a battlefield of its own. The building was old, its paint cracked, its ceiling tiles stained from years of leaks. Teachers cycled in and out, burned out from overcrowded classrooms. Naomi often found herself sitting in the back row, overlooked as louder students dominated the room. Her notebooks were filled with things that had nothing to do with the lessons on the board, sketches of chessboards, careful patterns of black and white squares, or stories she wove in her head about faraway places. She excelled quietly, her test scores often near the top, though few teachers noticed. When they handed back assignments, they rarely praised her work. Instead, they gravitated to the children whose parents donated to the PTA or showed up at meetings in polished suits. Naomi had learned long ago not to expect recognition. Then there were the other kids. They teased her for her worn sneakers, for the way her mother braided her hair in simple rows, for the fact that she often packed the same sandwich for lunch. Charity case, one girl whispered once, loud enough for Naomi to hear. She pretended not to notice, her pen scratching against the paper, but the words stuck like burrs. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind every time she wanted to shrink into the shadows. You belong wherever your feet land. Despite the challenges, Naomi had carved out her own world. On weekends, she often visited the community center, where volunteers organized chess clubs for kids. Naomi wasn't the loudest player, nor the one with the fanciest set. But when she leaned over the board, her brow furrowed in concentration, she saw patterns no one else did. Older players underestimated her, until she beat them. Again, one boy had groaned once, staring at the checkmate she'd forced in just 10 moves. Naomi had only smiled shyly, resetting the pieces. Chess wasn't about showing off. It was about strategy, patience, and the quiet confidence that came from seeing the whole board when others focused only on the next move. Her gift with children, her gift with chess, they came from the same place. Naomi had a way of seeing beneath the surface, of understanding what others missed. But outside the walls of the center, few people saw that. To the world, she was just another girl from a struggling neighborhood. Her mother saw more. Always. One evening, Naomi had found Danielle sitting on the edge of her bed, shoulders sagging after a double shift. Naomi had placed a cup of tea in her mother's hands, and Danielle had smiled through tired eyes. "You know," she said softly, brushing Naomi's cheek with her thumb, "I think God gave you something special, baby. Something the world hasn't figured out yet. But they will. One day, they will." Naomi held on to those words like a secret treasure, repeating them to herself whenever the world tried to convince her otherwise. That was why the trip to Europe meant so much. It wasn't just a flight, or a program, or a chance to see new places. It was proof that the world was bigger than the block she grew up on. Proof that her mother's words might be true, that she belonged anywhere her feet landed. And it was why, when she heard Isabella's cries echoing through the plane that night, she hadn't been able to stay in her seat. Because deep down, Naomi knew, she wasn't invisible. Not really. She just needed the chance to prove it. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, Ethan Caldwell found himself replaying the moment over and over. A billionaire brought to his knees by helplessness, saved by a child who expected nothing in return. It unsettled him. Inspired him. Haunted him. For Naomi, it was just one act of kindness. For Ethan, it was the first move in a game whose outcome neither of them could yet see. The flight landed in Paris under a pale morning sky. Passengers stretched stiff limbs, gathered bags, and hurried down the jet bridge, eager to escape the long night. Most would tell the story of the crying baby, the impossible silence that followed, and the little girl who had stunned them all. But for Ethan Caldwell, that story was far from over. He lingered at the gate, Isabella in his arms, scanning the sea of travelers until his eyes found her, Naomi, clutching her worn backpack, following her group leader with quiet steps. She looked smaller in the rush of bodies, as though the moment on the plane had been a dream. Something inside Ethan tightened. He couldn't let her disappear into the crowd. "Naomi." His voice carried across the terminal. Heads turned. Naomi froze, startled, then slowly turned back. He caught up to her, adjusting Isabella against his shoulder. For a moment, he felt strangely nervous, like a schoolboy fumbling for words. He began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "I wanted to thank you again. For last night." Naomi shifted her weight, eyes dropping. "It was nothing." "Nothing?" Ethan gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "You calmed my daughter when I couldn't. You saved an entire plane from mutiny. That's not nothing." Naomi's cheeks flushed, but she shook her head. "I just did what I always do." He studied her, this small figure with oversized courage. She deserved more than a passing thank you. She deserved something bigger. "Naomi," he said carefully, "what do you want for your future?" Her eyes flicked up, surprised by the question. "My future?" "Yes. When you grow up. What do you want to do? Where do you want to go?" Naomi hesitated, as though afraid her answer might sound foolish. Finally, she whispered, "I want to see the world. And maybe, help people. Like my mom does. She's a nurse's aide." Ethan nodded slowly. The answer was humble, but the way she said it carried a weight of sincerity that made his chest tighten. He glanced at Isabella, asleep against him, then back at Naomi. "Listen," he said. "I run a foundation, scholarships, mentorships, that kind of thing. If you'd let me, I'd like to sponsor your education. Whatever school you want, whatever resources you need. You shouldn't have to fight to be seen. You deserve every chance to become whatever you dream." Naomi's mouth parted in shock. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. "You'd do that?" "Yes." Ethan's voice was steady now, conviction building with each word. "Consider it my thank you. But more than that, it's an investment. Because I believe you have something rare. Something the world needs." Her group leader, standing nearby, looked equally stunned. "Mr. Caldwell, that's incredibly generous." But Naomi shook her head, almost panicked. "I can't. I don't want to be someone's charity case." Her words pierced him. He saw the pride in her stance, the steel in her small shoulders. This wasn't about money for her. It was about dignity. Ethan crouched slightly so his eyes met hers directly. "Naomi, this isn't charity. Charity is giving something to someone because you think they can't manage without you. This is different. This is me recognizing talent, strength, and heart. You've already proven yourself. All I want is to make sure the world sees it too." Her lips trembled. "But, why me?" "Because you're the only one who could calm my daughter when no one else could," he said softly. "Because you're braver than most adults I know. And because sometimes the right person comes into your life, and you don't ignore it." Naomi blinked hard, fighting back tears she didn't want to shed in public. Her group leader touched her shoulder. "Naomi, opportunities like this don't come often. Think about your mother. Think about what she would say." At the mention of her mother, Naomi's resolve wavered. She pictured Danielle, bent with exhaustion after another double shift, telling her she belonged anywhere her feet landed. Her chest tightened. Finally, she whispered, "If my mom says yes, then I'll say yes too." Ethan smiled faintly, relief washing over him. "Then let's ask her together. I'll arrange a call tonight." For the first time since the flight began, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't excitement, not yet, but it was hope. That night, in a modest apartment thousands of miles away, Danielle answered a video call from an unfamiliar number. Her eyes widened when the screen filled with the face of Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire she had only ever seen on news channels. And when he explained what her daughter had done, and what he wanted to offer, tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She looked at Naomi, her voice breaking. "Baby. I told you the world would see you one day. This is your chance. Take it." Naomi pressed her lips together, overwhelmed. But in her mother's eyes, she saw not pity, but pride. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world had room for her after all. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind. For Naomi, life shifted in ways she could hardly comprehend. She returned home to her neighborhood, but everything looked different, brighter, more possible. Ethan's foundation arranged tutors, mentors, even a scholarship to a prestigious academy that had once been far beyond her reach. At first, Naomi resisted. She worried about leaving behind her old school, her cousins, the familiar rhythm of her block. But her mother reminded her gently, "Baby, stepping into new places doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means showing the world what you carry with you." So Naomi stepped forward. At her new school, things weren't easy. The halls gleamed with polished floors, the classrooms filled with students in crisp uniforms. Many came from families with money and privilege. Naomi, in her simple clothes and shy demeanor, stuck out immediately. Whispers followed her. "Isn't she that charity kid? She doesn't belong here." But Naomi held her head high. She remembered Ethan's words on the plane, "You have a gift. You should never feel invisible." And slowly, she began to prove it. Her chance came at the regional chess championship, an event her new school entered every year, but rarely won. Naomi had been practicing in secret, playing against mentors, studying strategies late into the night with a notebook filled with diagrams. She didn't boast, didn't tell anyone what she could do. She simply prepared. On the morning of the competition, her nerves fluttered like wings in her chest. She looked small among the polished players in pressed blazers, their families gathered in the audience with expensive cameras. Danielle sat in the back, her hands clasped tightly, eyes shining with pride and fear. And in the front row, to her astonishment, sat Ethan Caldwell, his daughter Isabella in his lap, a faint smile on his usually guarded face. The tournament began. Round after round, Naomi faced opponents older, taller, more confident. They underestimated her every time. And every time, she quietly dismantled their strategies. Her eyes scanned the board, seeing moves 5 steps ahead, weaving traps they didn't notice until it was too late. One boy smirked at her, declaring, "Don't take it personally when you lose." Naomi didn't answer. 10 moves later, his king was cornered. The announcer declared her the new champion, placing the trophy in her small hands. The weight of it felt unreal, heavy not with metal but with meaning. She lifted her eyes and found Ethan's. For a moment, Billionaire and little girl simply stared at each other across the room. No barriers, no divides, only mutual respect. After the ceremony, the crowd swirled around her, judges offering congratulations, parents marveling, students staring in awe. But Naomi slipped past them all, running into her mother's arms. Danielle held her tight, whispering, "I told you, baby. The world would see you one day." Ethan approached quietly, Isabella perched on his shoulder. He crouched slightly, meeting Naomi at eye level. "You didn't just win today," he said softly. "You proved something much bigger. To them. To me. To yourself." Naomi clutched the trophy, her cheeks flushed. "I just played the way I always do." Ethan shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, Naomi. You played like someone who sees the whole board. That's a rare gift. Don't ever forget it." The cameras flashed, the applause faded, but in that moment, Naomi knew, her life had changed forever. She was no longer invisible. And somewhere deep inside, she understood that this was only the beginning. That night, long after the tournament crowd had dispersed and the cameras had been packed away, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, the trophy gleaming beside her. Her notebook lay open in her lap, but for once she didn't doodle chessboards or scribble daydreams. She just stared at the page, pen hovering, overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened. Her mother peeked in, arms crossed over her chest, a smile tugging at tired lips. "You still can't believe it, can you?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "It feels like a dream." Danielle walked over, sitting beside her daughter. "Dreams don't just happen, baby. You make them happen. With every choice, every bit of hard work, every time you decide not to give up." Naomi rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you really think I can do more? That I can, keep going?" Her mother kissed the top of her braids. "I don't just think it. I know it. And so does he." She gestured to the small card resting on Naomi's nightstand. Ethan Caldwell's card. A promise written in bold ink, "Whatever you need, school, mentorship, opportunity, I'll make sure you have it. You earned this." Across the city, in a suite overlooking Paris, Ethan stood at the window with Isabella in his arms. The baby stirred sleepily, then nestled into his chest. He tightened his hold, marveling at how natural it finally felt. He whispered softly, almost as if confessing to her, "She taught me, Izzy. That little girl taught me what no one else could." For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell didn't feel like a man who conquered the world. He felt like a man who had been changed by it, by a child who reminded him that the greatest lessons don't come from power, but from humility, kindness, and the courage to see others as they are. The story of Naomi and the billionaire began to spread, told and retold. Passengers who had been on that plane shared it with friends and family. Teachers used it as an example of empathy. Parents spoke of it as proof that wisdom doesn't always come with age or money. But for Naomi, it wasn't about fame. It was about possibility. About knowing that her voice mattered, her gifts mattered, and that even someone as powerful as Ethan Caldwell could see her, not as a charity case, but as an equal. One evening, weeks later, Naomi sat with Ethan in a quiet corner of the community center where she still came every weekend. Chessboards clicked all around them as children played, but they were in their own world. "You know," Ethan said, watching her reset the pieces, "business is a lot like this game. Everyone's focused on the next move, the next win. But the real players, they see the whole board." Naomi looked up, her eyes steady. "And sometimes the best move isn't about winning. It's about helping." Ethan smiled slowly, humbled once again. "Exactly." The narrator's voice, warm and steady, closed the chapter. This was never just a story about a crying baby on a plane. It was about something far greater. A reminder that wisdom and strength can come from the most unexpected places. That sometimes the person the world underestimates the most is the one who holds the power to change everything. A billionaire learned humility. A little black girl found her voice. And together, they discovered that the greatest victories aren't written in bank ledgers or trophies, but in the bridges we build between one another. The screen faded to Naomi's smile, her trophy glinting softly in the background, and then to Isabella's tiny hand curling around Naomi's finger. And maybe, just maybe, this is the lesson for all of us: never underestimate kindness. Never underestimate courage. And never underestimate the power of a child who dares to step forward when the world least expects it.